Hello and welcome back to The Perch from the Wyoming Tribune Eagle. I'm Noah Zahn, and this week we're bringing you a story from Casper. We're heading up there to the statewide housing forum hosted by the Wyoming Community Development Authority and bringing you the sounds and conversations that are going on there this week. But before we get into that, let's bring you a quick news roundup of what's been going on in the area lately. Hannah Shields, our state government reporter, what's going on with you?
So, as we all know, we just had our primary election last Tuesday, and one report that came out of it was just noticing the turnout, or rather lack of voter turnout, that we're seeing both in Laramie County and across the state. So in this year's primary election, according to unofficial results from the Secretary of State's office, there was a recorded just under 123,000 ballots cast in the entire state, which is the lowest recorded number of ballots cast in a primary election in Wyoming since 2016. For Laramie County, just over 18,500 ballots were cast in the primary election, which is about nearly 9,000 fewer cast than the last primary in 2022. Laramie County Clerk Deborah Lee told me voter registration was lower this year compared to 2022. However, it's important to note that in that 2022 primary election, it had garnered both statewide and nationwide attention when Trump-endorsed Harriet Hageman challenged Representative Liz Cheney for her seat in the House of Representatives, which she ended up ousting. On Friday, the Laramie County Canvassing Board certified the results from the primary election. And during that meeting, Lee announced a new write-in candidate for Cheyenne City Council Ward 3, Charles J. Madden. There was also another successful write-in candidate for Pine Bluff's mayor, Mary Cushing. Both of these nominees have been contacted by the clerk's office, and they have 5 days to accept the nomination. Lee also reported that there were Democratic write-ins for 8 local legislative races, 2 in the Senate and 6 in the House. However, because these are for statewide office, they were automatically sent to the Secretary of State's office for verification. So we'll likely find out about the results of those write-ins and whether or not we have any successful Democratic nominees during the state canvassing board meeting in the state capitol on Wednesday.
Thank you, Hannah. And now let's check in with Taylor Staples, our arts and entertainment reporter. You don't usually join us for this news portion of the podcast, but you've got something for us this week. What's going on there?
I don't usually do news, but last week I covered the ribbon cutting ceremony for the new Hillsdale Model Charter School in town, which is Cheyenne Classical Academy. It's essentially been under construction since January and has opened up right in time for school to start on Monday. The school is essentially a tuition-free school serving around 200 students in grades K through 5, but within the next 5 years, they said they want to expand it to a K through 12. Basically, at the event, Chairman Nathan Winters gave the main speech at the ceremony, expressing his hopes for the school and the future of Hillsdale model charter schools around the city. And then after his speech, the parents and kids were led in prayer, and then they were let loose to ask teachers any questions they wanted. Based on what the teachers and Winters were saying, it doesn't seem like their curriculum will be changing too much within the next 5 years, but they want to see maybe the opening of some different clubs and extracurriculars, but nothing is set in stone for the future.
And I know one of the big conversations around these charter schools is the funding for it. So is this fully publicly funded, or is there some private funding going towards it, or where does that come from?
Fully publicly funded, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so do you know if LCSD1 has any sort of contract with the Hillsdale College, the private university?
So their budget came through the state through the LCSD1 budget of $3.1 million, and according to board chairman Tim Bolin, it was only in a cursory way.
Great. Thank you, Taylor. Now let's head up to Casper and talk about housing. Earlier this year, the Wyoming Community Development Authority, or WCDA, released a report on housing, or lack thereof, across the state. It found that from 2021 to 2030, the state will need to add between 20,000 and nearly 40,000 housing units to meet demand. Between 2010 and 2021, the median rent in Wyoming increased by 32%. During that same time period, however, the median renter's income only rose by 18%. To address these concerns that are growing across the state and across the nation, WCDA contracted with Apt Global, who's a research and consulting firm, to craft a housing action plan catered to the specific needs of Wyoming and its communities. On Tuesday, I drove up to Casper to listen to them discuss what challenges they've identified so far and how they plan to address some of those. Apt Global Senior Associate Stephen Whitlow gave a presentation to the public.
So this has not been done yet in Wyoming. The idea is that there's a lot of housing activity that's already happening. There's a lot of different state resources, local resources that are being directed to housing. There's more need in that area. The plan, the idea behind the plan is that it's assessing where you are, kind of getting everyone rowing in the same direction, right? So it's setting goals for what you want to accomplish, then laying out the steps for how you get there.
Apt has conducted similar research projects across the country, from municipalities to working for the federal government. Although the housing crisis impacts areas across the country, Whitlow shared some of the challenges and approaches that are unique to Wyoming.
I think what makes Wyoming very different is your population, right? So it's both the small scale of the population and how dispersed the population is, right? And so that can make it challenging, right? Because like any industry, builders sort of want to be concentrated where there is demand for their product, right? So it just becomes more complicated when you just don't have as many households, you don't have as many people to generate that demand, which attracts those large-scale builders, right? So you're dealing with a smaller supply of builders, right, who can help address your housing challenge. They're going to places where there's just greater demand, greater population, like Fort Collins, like Denver, right, that are building a much grander scale of housing, right? That doesn't mean that you have to be Denver, that doesn't mean you have to be Fort Collins, but that is part of the challenge.
He told me some of the considerations his team has used to guide their process included that acknowledging that the same housing strategies that may work in one community or state may not work in another. Also, Wyomingites place great value on local decision-making and autonomy. The housing action plan should ideally aim for solutions that offer flexibility to localities to chart their own course. The plan will likely appeal to a wider audience of policymakers if it emphasizes the importance of housing to economic and workforce development, and the plan should be realistic. The first and perhaps most prominent challenge he outlined is funding limitations. Housing is expensive, and it's becoming more expensive. However, many of the factors causing this are beyond local or state control. Interest rates make it more costly and incentivize people to not leave their homes, which is particularly costly as Wyoming has an aging population that may find it more expensive to downsize. More than 1 out of 10 Wyoming residents who are over 65 live alone. According to the WCDA report, by 2030, it is projected that 1 in 4 Wyoming residents will be over 65. Whitlow said that federal programs available are not enough to support this housing shortage, and Wyoming has historically spent less on housing and community development, meaning that it is especially important that local and state entities step up. However, he said he has heard from many stakeholders in this process that localities struggle to generate this extra revenue that they need, which means that they're heavily dependent on the state. A common suggestion he heard is to develop a sort of flexible housing development fund that allows localities to use this money in a variety of ways for things like infrastructure, land acquisition, construction, or consultations. The next challenge he identified was the lack and cost of housing infrastructure. He mentioned the Wyoming Grant Assistance Program, which can help localities understand grant resources that are available to them and help them apply for and receive those grants. Further, some localities do not fully understand what types and level of infrastructure are needed to accommodate population growth in the most efficient way. Often this is due to short staffing, which led him to identify his next challenge, which is limited local capacity. Short-staffed counties or municipalities can often slow or even deter development, Whitlow told me. He suggested creating a one-stop shop for all Wyoming housing resources, a place where developers, nonprofits, buyers, government officials, etc., they can all go to learn more about what they need to know about housing in Wyoming. Whitlow also discussed the barriers to expanding city or town boundaries to areas that are good to develop on, particularly with water supply in mind.
One of the ideas is that it would be really valuable for the state to conduct some kind of analysis of where are places in Wyoming that are appropriate for growth, right? Not everywhere should grow, and some places won't be able to grow, right? There may be those limitations because of federal land, or there may be a lack of water capacity to expand. It's very difficult for all these small towns to figure that out on their own.
And lastly, he said it's important to address barriers to diversify housing availability. One way he suggested this is addressed is through pre-approved housing plans, which he said can help streamline the development process and diversify housing availability.
Rather than vetting each individual housing development, you come up with kind of a pre-described set of plans that you may approve. You may pre-approve, say, 30 different housing types, duplexes, quadruplexes, that the community gets to chime in and say, we like these look like our town, we would be happy for those to be built here, but you kind of do it in one fell swoop, right? And then a developer knows, if I build a house that looks like that, it's approved, and I don't have to go through the community approval process. That can be a way to facilitate faster development.
The meeting at Casper College on Tuesday was the first of 2 public outreach meetings for this housing action plan. Whitlow said that the second one, on October 21st, will likely be in Cheyenne. WCDA and APT will host a final public hearing on November 25th before finalizing the plan, and WCDA will likely share those findings with stakeholders and policymakers across the state to suggest the changes that they think are best suited for Wyoming.
Last week, I also wrote a story on Anime 307, which is a convention that's coming to Cheyenne on September 7th and 8th. It's going to be super, super cool. There's going to be like 16 voice actors from English dubbed animes there, and I think it's going to be awesome. But I kind of wanted to throw it to you guys and ask you what your favorite childhood cartoons were.
I remember my favorite shows as a kid were on PBS Kids Go. But I remember my favorite was Fetch with Rough Ruffman on Fridays at 5 p.m. That was a big excitement when I got to come home, but also the other shows, Cyber Chase, Dragon Tales, Arthur, all those ones, classics.
Personally, I was a big Cartoon Network gal. I have a brother that's 4.5 years older than me, so he dictated the TV most nights. So whatever he was watching, I tagged along. But I think probably my favorite childhood shows were probably Adventure Time and Regular Show. I did watch PBS Kids, but I was more of a like Nick Jr., I think it was called. I would watch Tom and Jerry before school on Cartoon Network, and then I'd flip to Nick Jr. and watch a little Dora, and then maybe I'd flip to Disney and watch what was Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. That was the big one. Yeah, I still love cartoons, so it's like definitely still of interest to me. But yeah, it kind of took over my whole life. I feel like I've been watching cartoons pretty much my whole life, which is cool.
My go-to cartoons. Also a fellow PBS kid. And I agree with Noah. I watched all of those shows as well. But I remember when I would watch Dragon Tales, and I don't know if anybody else would do this, but anytime they brought out the little dragon scale and they made their little wish that would transport them to Dragonland, I would say that wish with them, and I would place my hand on the screen without fail. I did
That's
that
so
many
cute.
times. I'm like, maybe it'll work this time.
Well, thank you, Hannah and Taylor, for bringing us that fun conversation at the end. That's all for this week. Be sure to tune back in next Wednesday.